the North-South Project. I got it. So I'm connected to the community because of the fact that my husband is Aboriginal and I'm mixed heritage Métis and Chinese. My husband is Ojibwe from Alderville First Nation, and that's here in Ontario, and there's about, I think about 133 reserves in Ontario and about 860 reserves across Canada. And my husband, he was raised in children's aid care, and all of his ancestors were raised in residential school, his mother, his grandmother, and those before him. And so he has residential school and children's aid in his bloodline, and I have residential school in my bloodline. And so together, for the first time, we've actually broken the cycle, and we've raised our own children without being in residential school and without being in children's aid care for the first time in the Anderson bloodline. So when I go into the community and I speak on foster parenting, and I tell them, tell the community, whether it's a non-Aboriginal community or an Aboriginal community, my husband's story of being raised in care and his ancestors, all of his bloodline being in residential school, and how my children are the very first generation that have not been raised in children's aid care. Interestingly, I get a round of applause, and non-fail, people in the audience always clap for that. And I think to myself, you know, what a shame that is, that you birth out your children and that your whole goal as an Aboriginal person is not to have your child raised in the child welfare system. That really is not a goal or a standard of living that a non-Aboriginal person expects in life. You don't expect to raise your children and have them scooped by the child welfare system or raised in child welfare. You don't expect that of your own children, and it's a pretty common goal of most new mothers to raise their children and to do a good job and to be a good parent. And it's very difficult for Aboriginal mothers, for young Aboriginal mothers that have that carry the burden and the trauma, the intergenerational trauma of residential school and the child welfare system as a result, to be a young Aboriginal parent and to carry that weight and to try to do a better job with your own children without knowing better. And it's not their fault because their parents were raised in the child welfare system, or their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents were raised in residential school, literally bankrupt of culture, bankrupt of love, and bankrupt of any sort of caring, loving, nurturing family system. And if you think about where we learn our values, it's in the family. And so to be raised in an institutional setting without unconditional love, the unconditional love that your parent has for their child, that really impacts a person's identity. It impacts their soul. There's a lot of Canadians that don't know the Aboriginal history of residential school. They don't understand why there are so many Aboriginal people that live in poverty, and that there's this stigma and stereotype of a lazy Indian. And in the meantime, you know, this poverty was imposed upon Aboriginal people through Canada's history. And if you look at any culture and what is the strength of a culture, it's in their language and in their customs. And in order to do that, you need to be able to teach that to the children. And some of these parents, because of the fact that they were raised in residential school, they weren't able to practice their customs and traditions. They didn't grow up with those customs and traditions that their parents and their grandparents grew up with, because residential school systemically tried to destroy the culture. And some parents have been raised literally bankrupt of culture, and that's through the direct result of residential school. And then as a result of that, it basically had a horrible impact on parenting, raising parents that were raising their children with intergenerational trauma, that were carrying a lot of baggage, substance abuse, and emotional and physical and sexual abuse from residential school. And all of that trauma really did play out into poor parenting. And as a result, there's an overrepresentation of Aboriginal children in our child welfare system, and an overrepresentation overrepresentation of Aboriginal people in Canada's criminal justice system and in our prison system. And then again, there's an overrepresentation of Aboriginal people who are homeless. You know, you can walk through the streets of Toronto and you see stereotypical images of Aboriginal people homeless, drunk, sleeping on the streets, and that's just a small part of the population of the Aboriginal community. That's not the Aboriginal community. That's just a horrible stereotype that a lot of people have adopted in Canada because of the fact that they don't know any Aboriginal people. There are many Canadians that don't know Aboriginal people. And so that's what they see. They either see that stereotypical image on the streets, or maybe perhaps a romantic vision and concept of Aboriginal people. You know, the savage Indian, the noble Indian, you know, from the 1800s. And so, you know, that's the image that we have to work hard in terms of the Aboriginal community forming relationships with all Canadians.